In the past two videos, we've been looking at the whole idea of simple yet not simplistic, about how to build a method that supports that actual idea, using the whole principles on itself. So in this video, we'll look at some of the things that we actually did to make this happen, looking at all the different metaphors, the different assumptions, the challenges that we had to face to make it all work. The challenge that we faced when trying to build an EA method that would cover the full scope and scale was to find a way to simplify the very real complexity that covers the whole of that space. Let's take a look at some of the dimensions of that complexity. The first one is fairly straightforward, that we have one thing that follows another. Nothing complicated there, step by step. But we then want to find diving down into the detail. So if we think of that as step by step, then these dive down into deeper and deeper levels of detail. And we're also running many things in parallel. So straight away we've got three dimensions that are all clashing with each other. So for example, each of these has its own step by step and is often running things in parallel as well. And each of those have their own detail. So you can see the complexity builds very fast indeed. To add to the complexity on top of that, something that we find here in this place might well cause us to redesign or rethink what we were doing back over here. So if you think of that as being the step-by-step, the sequence, the chain, the links, that's the parallel, that's the detail. These are links from any point to any point, and that may cause us to go back and rethink. So this builds, and all the time we have to find a way to store the information so that we can get at it again. And also, insights can appear completely at random. So right down in the detail somewhere here is insight, light bulb, whee! That may not be relevant even to the task that we're doing, but may well be important elsewhere. So that was the challenge we faced. So the place we started was a very classic, very old model, slightly reworked, which is the old group dynamics or forming, storming, norming sequence, also the Chinese 5 elements sequence, which we framed as purpose, people, preparation, process and performance, all rotating around a kind of pivot. That was our starting point. But we needed to make it human, we needed to make it accessible, we needed to handle all of this complexity all in one go. So to make it more human, the first thing we did was to literally make it human. We built it as a kind of series of rooms around a central atrium. Each of these being, for example, similar to the way that strategy people work, the way that people work, the preparation, the planning of something, the actual doing of the work, the process, then following through on what did we do, what did we learn. Always we're looking for this basic principle of what's the big picture, what are the boundaries, what's the plan or the preparation, what are we actually doing, what are we capturing right now, what have we learned from this, how well did we do in terms of the original purpose. But we soon found that while that handles the step-by-step aspects and the continuation and the linking of things, it didn't handle parallel and it didn't handle detail. So we tried another way. So the next metaphor was to emphasize again the people part of this and to focus on how information flowed back and forth, how we kept returning to this central atrium as the place where we stored the information, and so that we could possibly go back if we need to. It isn't just a fixed step by step. But we found that that didn't handle the problem of parallel or detail either. It made it more human, it made it more accessible, but it still didn't actually solve the problem. In the next attempt, we focused on the storing of information, so that we had this idea of the pathway, where there was a loop to it, but we store the information at the end of each phase, and each phase is quite distinct. But again, that gives us the idea of the step-by-step looping, which it often does, but it still doesn't tackle the parallel. It does tackle the storing of information, but it doesn't tackle the detail, nor this building level of complexity. So the next one we focused on making that previous one was rather clumsy with the emphasis too much on the storing of information. So I used the idea of folders. We're collecting information and storing it in folders. And again, making it human by putting people in the space, by making it human, but emphasizing much more clearly what's going on. We now dropped the idea of a loop, because what it was is just a pattern, and the pattern may appear in each place, in each way. It's still just the same pattern. A loop is a particular type of step-by-step relationship, but it isn't the only one. In another phase, we emphasized the folders even more and what happens inside the folders, but a side effect of that was we actually dropped it made it less human. We found that all the attempts to make it human actually got in the way. So we still kept the person in there, making it real and focusing much more around the actual tasks and concerns being done. But we tackled the complexity by, in a sense, not tackling it, but by building the complexity in the way it related rather than trying to put it into the pattern itself. In the form that's in the final book, this is essentially just the same idea. We've accepted that we can't actually include all of the complexity, but by focusing on the pattern and keeping the pattern consistent every time, we end up with something that is still absolutely consistent, every scope, every scale, any type of content, any type of context. We're identifying these. We start a mission, which is essentially one of these packaged down. We start with an issue. We identify who's going to do it, why we're doing it, what the actual question is, and what we're going to do with it. We then use this structure, this standard pattern. What's the big picture? What's the boundaries? Who's involved? Who's making those choices? What is the plan, the preparation for any given task? What's the action for any given task? What's the review for any given task? So these often become just little more than checks, whereas these are the ones we do all the time. At the end of a folder, we're reviewing the whole thing, which is giving us the answer. And we tackle the complexity by, in a sense, removing it and yet still leaving all the hooks in place to handle all the types of complexity that may arise. That's what's in the book. That's what we settled on as being the best approach that we could do to keep it simple in the midst of enormous complexity. So that's the basic change mapping method or approach. What's the issue? Let's start a mission. Within this we have any number of what's the context, what's the scope, enormous numbers of plan, action, review, plan, action, review, plan, action, review, with an ending to do the review of the whole and returning the answer that we need. Thanks for watching. Do look at the YouTube description for links to further detail. And don't forget to subscribe for other videos and also to support us on Patreon to help us produce these videos and the tools themselves.